Thank you very much. I'm going to start off with just the overall safeguarding environment. We have the vulnerable that we're trying to protect in the middle. The circle outside of that is those who have direct contact. Can everyone hear me okay? Is that better? Right, how about, is that better? Can you hear me now? Right, thank you very much, Suzanne. Right, so the next circle is those who have direct interaction with the vulnerable. The circle after that is those that have indirect interaction with the vulnerable. And then the outside circle is those that are regulatory bodies and people that, when there's concerns and such, will deal with those. So it's a pretty complex, it's a very involved environment, and everybody, each one of us has a part to play, and we've heard the phrase over and over again about working together and to enable us to protect the vulnerable, and that's very much what we need to do, is to work together. At the Disclosure and Barring Service, our role is, I'm going the wrong direction, sorry about this. Our role is to issue disclosure checks for you. So we do that to help you make safer recruitment decisions, to when you're going to make your employment decisions, to help you. But also our role is to prevent unsuitable people working with vulnerable groups, including children. And that's something we can only do with your help. So very much my presentation today is to ask for your help. We have 4 different DBS disclosure checks. What I'm not going to do is go into detail about each one and what each one, the types of roles. Certainly if there's anything you want to know, please come and speak to us afterwards. But the one I think that most of you here will use is, for those in regulated activity, would be an enhanced disclosure with the barred list check. And one of the reasons I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about those disclosure checks, although they're very important, and they do help with those recruitment decisions, the important thing to remember is nowhere on those checks does it state this person is safe to work with the vulnerable, because we just don't know. We can tell you and put information that we know about an individual, but if somebody was, perhaps they have abused an elderly person in the past, but had never come under the police radar, there's going to be nothing on that check to tell you that. So we don't know if that person is safe. So the work that you do, the ongoing monitoring of those that you employ, those that are being looked after, that you watch for changes in the behavior of those staff members or the behavior of those they're caring for. That's every bit as important as having those DBS certificates. What we're going to look at now is a duty to refer. And this is a legal duty. It isn't a case of making a decision if you should or if you shouldn't. If certain conditions exist, and I'll go through those conditions, you must make a referral to DBS. And it's by those referrals that we are that enable us to remove people from working with the vulnerable and bar them. But unless we get the information from yourselves, we're not able to do that. So a regulated activity provider, anyone, for example, running care homes and such, is a regulated activity provider, and they have a legal duty, if the conditions are met, they must make a referral to us. For personnel suppliers, anyone supplying personnel to work in regulated activity, the legal duty lies with them. They must make a referral to us if those conditions are met. A power to make a referral, that lies with local authorities, with keepers of registers such as CQC, and we've also got statutory authorities. So we're looking at CQC there. When we're talking about the difference between the power and the legal duty, sometimes people feel that when they have a legal duty, if they make a referral to us and perhaps we don't bar someone, they feel a bit uncomfortable that, well, what if this individual comes back and tries to sue me? Because defamation of character, they've referred me to DBS and they haven't actually barred me, so they might actually sue the organisation. And it's just to reassure you that if you're referring to us under the legal duty, They cannot do that because the law has said you must make the referral to DBS. So therefore, you're protected, and they can't make that assumption. So again, anything I'm talking about, if you have any questions, maybe not even just today after the session, sometimes when you go away and you think about things, you think of questions then. The presentation has contact details, so please get in touch with us, because we're not a faceless organization. We're there to help with you. If you think maybe you should be making a referral but you're unsure, talk to us, speak to us, and we'll guide you on that. What I'll look at now is when you actually must make that referral. There's two main conditions, the first of which is that you've removed someone from working in regulated activity. So it could be that you've dismissed them. There's been an allegation and you have dismissed them. It could be that you've redeployed them. You've taken them out of harm's way. Maybe you're concerned that they may hurt someone vulnerable, so therefore you've given them a back office job, so they're out of the way. And you might feel quite comfortable that you've protected the vulnerable. However, you've still removed them from regulated activity, so that meets that first condition where you must make a referral to us. It could be that they have resigned. It could be that they've taken retirement or redundancy. And there are also reasons to meet that condition where you must refer to us. And again, even though it feels, well, it's no longer your problem because they're not going to hurt anyone, they've left your organization, it's still important because all they will do is go and work somewhere else, and that just problem goes on and on and on. And they can harm as they go unless you can get that information to us. And particularly if someone resigns, and very often people feel that because they only maybe have one side, they've approached someone with an allegation to say, you know, what has happened and what has been, what's been suggested, and that person can get very upset and say, I would never do something like that. This is disgusting, and they walk out. And sometimes organizations feel, well, we only have one side of the story. We don't have any other information. It's still important that you make that referral to us. What you don't know is that person could have been referred to us before. So we could have other information on that, but not enough maybe to bar the person. But the additional information that you provide us with might just be enough to tip the balance for us to be able to show that that person is a risk, and therefore we possibly could bar them. But if you don't give us that information, if you don't share it with us, we're not going to be able to do that. So that's the first condition. Second condition, and again, I'll just put everything up to save me having to keep trying to click it. The reason that you've removed them from regulated activity, whether it's you've redeployed them or dismissed them, the reason for that is, firstly, that they've possibly been involved in relevant conduct. And relevant conduct, we're talking about harm, but harm in the widest possible context. So it's not just physical or sexual, which is what initially springs to mind, but it could be verbal abuse, which isn't just screaming and shouting at someone. It could be emotional. It could be psychological. So it's the whole sphere of harm that to think about. And it's not just that the person is the actual perpetrator. It could be that their actions have put someone at risk of harm. It could be that they have directly caused someone harm. It could be that they've incited others. They haven't actually done it themselves, but they've encouraged or they've incited other people to do it. So again, it's just bearing in mind, even if the individual isn't the one that's carried out the act, if that's the reason that there's been harm caused, or as I say, their actions have resulted in someone harm, then it meets that condition that second condition for that referral. The next is the harm test. And that's a little bit more difficult to understand, because what we're saying here, it's not that somebody's actually done something, it's if they may do it, that they may hurt someone, they may incite others. And what we're not asking you to do is have a crystal ball and guess if somebody may hurt someone. So it's not something where maybe somebody makes you feel uncomfortable, they make you feel uneasy. It's not that. There has to be evidence. And to give you just an example, in a care home, we had a situation where a carer was referred to us, And what had happened was there was one particular service user that she absolutely detested and was constantly complaining about her. She would complain to all the other staff members, she would complain to the management about how much this woman actually annoyed her. And she said that she would go into her room and all she wanted to do was to take a pillow and smother her. And she said this so many times, and I think maybe those of you out there, if you've got partners or perhaps children, there might be many times where you've thought, where they're driving you nuts, and you've thought, gosh, if I had a pillow. But we're not talking about a flippant throwaway comment. We're talking about where someone has said this so vehemently, so often, the care home actually dismissed her. Now, that wasn't because of what she did. It was because they had evidence to show what she might do, and the fear of what she might do was why they dismissed her. So that makes the conditions to make a referral to us. One, the lady has been removed, and two, it wasn't that she physically harmed someone, but there was that risk that she may harm someone, and that's why she had been dismissed. So again, it's just bearing in mind that there could be situations where someone not necessarily has actually carried out the harm, but they may, and that's why you've let them go. So just bear that in mind, and don't, sometimes people do feel, well, nobody was actually harmed, so it's not a referral to DBS. It most certainly would be a referral to us. The next on the list there is if somebody has received a caution or a conviction for a relevant offence. Relevant offences are very serious offences, and they come in two categories. They're known as automatic bars. They are automatic bars where there is no right to representation. For example, rape of a child would be one. If somebody commits that offence, they are automatically included in the barred list, and that's it. But there's also those where there is the right to send in representations. People can put their side of things to us, and we would look at that information and make a decision if they should or shouldn't be included in the barred list. Willful neglect of a child is one. And you might kind of think, well, gosh, if somebody's willfully neglected a child, why on earth would that not be an automatic bar? But again, just to clarify that a little, we had, again, a lady who, as it happened, she worked in a care home, by the by, but what happened was she had a young child. She had two children, but the young child was had a fever, was poorly, so she'd gone out to the chemist, which was literally on the corner of where she lived, to get some Calpol. She'd taken the younger child with her, and once she was gone, the landlord came and was knocking at the door. There wasn't any answer, and he could hear a child distressed, a child crying, so the police were called. When the lady came back, and she'd only been gone probably about 10 minutes, I think, when she came back, her door had been knocked in, the police were there, and she received a caution, willful neglect of a child, because you can't leave a child unattended. It came into us as a referral because it was a relevant offence, but with the right to representation. So when she sent her representations in, we had, as I said, she worked in a care home. We had references from where she worked to say that she was tremendously a wonderful carer with the elderly, and they had no problems. The school were able to reassure us that there was no problems with the children in school, and social services also confirmed that they had no issues and no concerns. And whilst we're not recommending that you leave a child unattended, our role at DBS is not to punish people. Our role is to look at and establish, has something happened? If it has, is that individual a future risk of harm? And that's where we would bar someone. In this particular case, there was no evidence to show us that this woman was a risk to harm anyone. So the decision was not to include her in the barred list. We do hold on to that information because if that person were ever to come back to us, we would look and review that again. But again, it's just to point out that, very importantly, that our role isn't to punish. Now, also I want to mention that we can only bar someone who actually is in regulated activity, has in the past at some time been in regulated activity, or may in the future. And again, may in the future, we don't need a crystal ball. If you're training to be a doctor, a nurse, a carer, then that would be the case. And sometimes that makes people very uneasy because they feel, well, hang on a second, if somebody commits a crime now and they're not barred because they don't work in regulated activity, what about down the road if they come 6 months later to come and work in a care home? And they would have been barred had they been in that role at the time. Well, there isn't anything to fear, because one of the reasons that we have disclosure and barring is that as soon as you go to work in regulated activity, you will request a DBS disclosure. And once that enhanced check comes up, we will see from the police information that there has been an incident, and immediately what we will do then is look at that case to consider whether that person should or should not be barred. So although we can't bar if you're not in regulated activity, if ever you do work in regulated activity, we will find out about it. So what I'm not going to do is go through this, because I could spend an hour just going through this. This is the decision-making tool that we use, and it was designed by experts in the field. And I'm just going to quickly flick through it. And as I say, I'm not going to go into great detail, because what I really just want to highlight with this slide is that it isn't an easy decision to bar someone. There's a lot of things we need to consider. We have to be proportionate. We have to be considered. We could be ending someone's career. So we have to make sure that the decision we make is right, but we have to protect the vulnerable as well. We cannot investigate. The law does not allow us to. So if we get a referral, there's information there where we think, oh my goodness, the police must have been involved in this. We can't go to the local police force and say, oh, by the way, have you got any information? Because the law doesn't allow us. We cannot go on a fishing expedition. If you tell us the police were involved, then we can go directly to them and get that information. If social services were involved, if you tell us, we can go to them and get information, maybe even information that you don't have that on other members of the person's family. But only if you tell us. We can't go, as I say, on a fishing expedition. So it's important that you do, but it's also important that you give us as much information as possible to paint a picture for us. You can imagine you have a caseworker who gets a file and is reading through it. You know the individual, you hired them. We don't. You know the victim, the person that's been harmed. We don't. So we need to know, what is their care plan? What are the actions that should have been taken? Did this person know this? What's that person's training? Were they trained maybe using a hoist? Where we can say that they were trained, they knew the correct way to do it, but they didn't. They took a shortcut. Or if perhaps we'll be able to say, well, they never were trained. So we would want to look at that, and were they told never to use a hoist, or had somebody told them that they had to go do that? So we need to be very fair in the way we're looking at things. We need to understand, where have they worked before? Have they gone from job to job to job, or have they had steady employment? Because all these things help us build a picture of who this person is, because what we're trying to determine is, has the incident happened? And if it has, is this person a future risk? And by the information that you send us, that's how we can determine if that person is. One of the ways that we differ from the police, to take something to court, you need to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. So there may be situations where perhaps there's been an incident and the police are not taking it further. Because to take it to court and prove beyond a reasonable doubt, if someone perhaps is vulnerable, whether it's a child or it's an adult, it could be felt that they wouldn't be a credible witness, and because of that, it isn't taken any further. We work on the balance of probabilities that something is more likely to have happened than not. So it's important, very important, that even if there's an incident and the police are not going to take it any further, it's imperative that you still let us know, because there have been instances where the police perhaps haven't taken something forward because the person was not deemed a credible witness, but we have been able to look at that case and we've been able to bar that individual, but only if we get the information from people like yourselves. It's absolutely vital. Just to give you a quick recap on the information that we need, because that is so important, because without your help and without the information from you, we cannot bar anyone. Oops. Going a bit quick there. So we need it timely. We need you to get the information to us as quickly as possible, because whilst we're waiting to get that information, that individual is going to work somewhere else and can, harm again. And there's nothing, that you're innocent till you're proven guilty. So the sooner you can get the information to us, the better. However, it has to be, we want it to be accurate. We want to make sure you've got all the information. So we don't want you to cut corners. It will take what it takes, but just to bear in mind, the sooner we can get the information, the sooner that we can start to consider. We have a referral form. You can do it online or you can fill in the paper form. We need as much information. It will give you suggestions of what type of information we would need. And again, it's not exhaustive. And again, the chronology for us to understand what way and which order things have happened in. Training and supervision records, internal and external investigations, and all this information. And I know it's a lot of information for you to put together, but it's very important we have that so we can make the right decision. And again, bear in mind that any information that we have, we will share with the individual if the decision is to bar that individual. If the decision is that we'll bar someone, when we send the information out, we let them know we're considering barring them, and this is the reason why. They don't have to guess why we're considering barring them. We send them the information so they can see if there's maybe something there we haven't considered, and then they will get back in touch with us to put their side of things, which we will then look to see, does that change anything? If it does, we may reverse the decision to bar, and if it doesn't, then we would go ahead and bar. But again, if you send us any information and you redact it, can I ask you please be thoughtful in your redactions, because sometimes we get redactions that are so great, it's impossible to know who said what to whom or what on earth is going on because everything is redacted out. We've got 3 pages ones that were completely black. I mean, completely. So there's just no way we can do anything with that. On the slide there, you've got the contact numbers so that if there is any information that you require or any questions that you want to ask, then please do get in touch. And I'm just looking at my watch now, so I know my time is up. I appreciate so much your time, and I thank you very, very much. We'll take questions at the end. Can I please say thank you that if this would be my daughter's worst nightmare, to have to sit and listen to me for all this time. So I do really appreciate your patience, and I thank you very, very much. So thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Natalie Crisp. I am the Adult Social Care Inspection Manager covering Bexley, Bromley and Greenwich from the Care Quality Commission. I'm mindful of time too, so I'm going to skim over some of my slides. So if you feel like this is a whistle-stop tour of what CQC think about safeguarding, I'm more than happy to take any questions and hang around and answer any questions that you may have. So what does CQC do? So we make sure health and social care services provide people with safe, effective, compassionate, high quality care, and we encourage services to improve. And we do this through registering services. Each and every service providing a regulated activity, as we've heard earlier, has to register with the Care Quality Commission. As part of that, we look at safeguarding processes and procedures from the moment that someone wants to set up that service. It's a rigorous process. There's a separate team, entirely separate to my team of inspectors. And as I said, safeguarding is an integral part of what they look at before those services are allowed to open their doors. We monitor, inspect and rate services. So I think when you think of CQC, this is what you think of. You think now of our ratings, our inspection reports that are available on the website and hopefully used to make an informed decision about care. And obviously part of that, again, we look at safeguarding. So within our safe domain, my inspectors go out, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the regulation which underpins that and some of the good and bad things that we've seen. But safeguarding is an integral part when we're going out and making sure that people are safe. We enforce, so we take action if people aren't getting the care that they deserve. So if we're talking explicitly about safeguarding, if people aren't being safeguarded appropriately, that's a breach of regulation. My inspectors can take civil or criminal action regarding that. Civil action could be us issuing a warning notice and saying, you must improve by this date and people must be safe. We could take more stringent civil action and we could issue a notice of proposal to cancel. So we could effectively remove a provider's ability to provide a regulated activity. Or we can take criminal action for a breach of Regulation 13. So since 2015, CQC has had powers to criminally prosecute for breaches of Regulation 12, so if people aren't being provided with safe care and treatment, Regulation 13, which is all about safeguarding, and Regulation 14, which is all about if people haven't got enough food and fluid in order to be able to survive. And we can issue large fines or we can imprison people. So, and we're an independent voice. So we provide an independent voice on the state of health and social care within the UK, or England specifically. So in doing that, we've done thematic reviews, which have looked at things such as mental health provision for adults and children and the state of care itself. So this slide here sets out the scene for across England, but I think perhaps of interest to everyone in the room today, we've got 119 services registered with CQC in Bromley. So that's care homes, nursing homes and domiciliary care agencies. And as with lots of large organisations, I did try and pull the stats for you today to find out which, how many care homes, how many nursing homes and how many domiciliary care agencies. And unfortunately everything crashed, but I can assure you it's 119 services. So I'm just going to slip over that one. So for us, this is what we say as an organisation safeguarding means. So safeguarding means protecting people's health, well-being and human rights and enabling them to live free from harm, abuse and neglect. And it's a fundamental part of ensuring high-quality health and social care. Oh, and it seems to have frozen. There we go. So how do we do this? Thank you. So we ensure that providers have effective systems and processes. So as I said, in order to walk in the door in the first place and be registered with CQC, you need to be able to demonstrate that you've got effective systems and processes in place to safeguard people. We use our intelligent monitoring to assess risk. So, I mean, there's lots of stuff that CQC use to analyse risk. Some of that's stats around whether or not a service has a registered manager, because leadership is known to be fundamentally important with regards to ensuring a safe service. Without that leadership in a service, things tend to slide. And obviously without that role model with regards to good practice, that's when things kind of tend to fall apart. We use information we receive through statutory notifications from providers. So under the Care Act, under the Health and Social Care Act, providers have got to tell us if there is an allegation of abuse which happens in a service. So obviously the local authority safeguarding team has got a duty to accept safeguarding referrals and to investigate those. We're not there to make a decision about whether or not that allegation of abuse what occurred or not, but legally all services that are registered with us need to have told us that an allegation of abuse has occurred. We use information we receive from people that use the services, from families and from staff. So we've got a big contact centre up in Newcastle. If you call CQC's 03000 number, that's who you get put through to. And they analyse tons of information from, I've got really severe safeguarding concerns that my mum's being abused. I went in, I saw staff, throwing her around, and then that will get passed straight through to an inspector to, I've got concerns around the environment, I've got concerns around the food. But all of that information gets processed and analysed by us to make our decisions around regulation. We make sure that the right people act at the right time to keep people safe. So when we receive that information, we don't just sit on it. As I said, we're not the decision makers around what's the safeguarding and what's not. So our team up in Newcastle and inspectors within my team, if they receive concerns, they make referrals to the local authority for them to do their work. And if necessary, then obviously we also alert the police. If we're out on inspection and we see something that we've got concerns about, we'll talk to providers about that. In an ideal world, a provider's going to be the one raising a safeguarding alert. It's not going to be us. But if that doesn't happen, then obviously we will raise those alerts ourselves, either right there and then or later on, depending on the severity of what we've seen. And we hold providers to account, and we'll take regulatory action where necessary, which I kind of covered in our enforcement, when I mentioned about enforcement briefly. And ultimately, we work with local partners to share information. So my team sits on the local authority sharing group within Bromley. We've got good links with those in safeguarding in the CCG, and we're all sharing information. It's that low-level stuff, a bit like you were saying about you hear something, and then it's only when something happens again and again that you start to pick up a picture. And that's why it's so important that we've got those open lines of communication. So we don't work in isolation. As I said before, we've got our team up in Newcastle dealing and processing with all of the concerns that come in from the general public. My team are going out, they're doing their inspections, they're meeting people when they're using services, they're using their observations, they're having those conversations when they're there on the ground. And we share that information widely. We're participants within the Safeguarding Adults Board as well. Obviously, it's great to be invited here today. And in terms of being able to share that information, that is what's really key in terms of our partnerships. And we also participate in safeguarding adults and children's reviews. So although my team are the adult social care inspectors, we have got teams within CQC that also inspect children's services across a kind of health and social care provision. They will do joint inspections with Ofsted. And obviously, if there's been a child safeguarding concern, then they'll participate in that. So we'll provide information. And obviously, it's a basis for us all to learn when things have gone wrong. So Regulation 13, I mentioned regulations very briefly before, and obviously that's something that I use every day. But in the Health and Social Care Act, the regulations are set out to say these are the fundamental standards which services must achieve. So Regulation 13 is our safeguarding regulation, and it talks about safeguarding service users from abuse and improper treatment. So we expect providers to have systems and processes in place that keep people safe from harm. We expect them to have trained staff to recognise different types of safeguarding and what to do if there are safeguarding concerns within a service. We expect them to raise those alerts with the local authority when they happen. We expect them to be open and honest and transparent. We've got something called the duty of candour, where we say you've got to admit when things have gone wrong and have those conversations with people and apologise if that's the case. And if services aren't meeting this, then obviously we'll take regulatory action. So these are common things that inspectors see, and if you read our inspection reports, services fall down on when they're looking at safeguarding processes. So first, very simply, is staff not being able to tell us what abuse is or how to raise concerns. And I was talking to someone from a hospital trust quite recently, and they were saying it's really frustrating because in our inspections, they're only as good as the people you speak to. And they were right to a certain extent, because if you speak to 3 members of staff that can't tell you what abuse might look like or what actions they would take, then that's a big concern for us as a regulator. And you might have sat your staff through training and you might have assessed their competency. And on the day, I used to manage services, they might not be able to answer those questions. So if you are a provider, and I know there's providers in the rooms, thinking about how you're supporting your staff in preparation for those CQC inspections, because we will report, and it would be a breach of Regulation 13 if the staff that we spoke with don't know how to respond to safeguarding concerns. Staff not recognising vulnerable adult instances as abuse. As I said, we're not the decision makers in terms of safeguarding. I can't tell you right now every single incident, yes, this would be accepted by the local authority or not. But what I am going to tell you is that I would expect that if there was an incident between 2 service users or people that were living in your service or using your service, and there was an incident and somebody got hurt, we would expect to be notified about that as a safeguarding allegation, and I would expect you to have had a conversation with the local authority about, is that an allegation of abuse or not. And if you can demonstrate that you've had that conversation with the local authority and they weren't interested, that's absolutely fine. But as I said, we're not decision makers, the local authority are. And so you need to demonstrate that you followed due process. Failing to notify CQC of allegations of abuse. This is a real bugbear of mine. I think some of the regulations, we talk about what is person-centred care and what is respect and dignity. And you could have a really abstract conversation about what does good care look like. And there's not a hard and fast rule necessarily. But what is very clear and very explicit is that you have to submit a notification. And it's really frustrating if you've got a good service that is doing what they need to be doing and they just haven't notified us, because unfortunately that is a breach of the regulations. We can fine providers now. It's about £5,000. I keep saying to my team, I don't want us to turn into parking wardens and start issuing fines left, right and centre. But fundamentally, that's the powers that we've got now. And not adhering to conditions on people's doles. So we look at the Mental Capacity Act as part of our inspection process, but doles and restrictions of people's liberty for us explicitly comes under a provider's safeguarding kind of responsibilities. So in order to ensure that you're meeting those, doles conditions have got to be demonstrated to have been adhered to. And sometimes that's really easy, sometimes there's no conditions at all. Sometimes they're kind of stuff about reviewing people's care and support to ensure that they're not being unnecessarily restricted. And sometimes they're really explicit, like this person needs to go out every single week. And if that's the case and it's not happening, it's very clear again for us that those conditions aren't being met, and that would be a breach of Regulation 13. But it's not all doom and gloom. There are some absolutely fantastic examples of services that are out there doing really innovative things with safeguarding. And for anyone that's interested, and if you haven't already seen it, we changed slightly our methodology back in November last year, and we've changed the characteristics of our ratings. So previously we talked about what is outstanding for safe and what is good for safe. And now we talk about, for each key line of inquiry, of which safeguarding is one, what does good practice look like? What does outstanding practice look like? And so it gives, I think, providers a much better sense of actually what is it that they could be doing that could be reaching above and beyond. So I don't need to read all of these out to you. But I think for me, for the outstanding services that I've been into, and I think safe is a really hard domain to get outstanding. If you look at the stats, well-led, caring and responsive tend to be the ones that people manage to hit the most. But those services that are really going above and beyond have involved people that are using their services in their safeguarding processes and procedures. So I've been to a service where people had very profound learning disabilities and could display high levels of behaviour that challenged, but staff knew people so well, and the monitoring that they were doing helped pick up on slight changes in people's behaviour, which indicated that they weren't happy with someone that was at the service, a staff member. And that was what was used to instigate kind of the start of a process, which ultimately ended up with a staff member being dismissed and being referred to the DBS. And so it's about being imaginative, it's about being creative, but it's about putting people at the heart of services. I think there's 2 slides on that, but like I said, I don't need to just read them out to you. So there's more information on CQC's website about joint inspections that we do, as I said, with Ofsted, the powers that we've got if we're going into a mental health trust to specifically look at people that are being detained under the Mental Health Act, and lots of information specifically about Regulation 13. So if you're interested, it's there. And thank you.
My name's been spelt 3 different ways today. It's getting more and more interesting as the day goes on. I've just been asked to talk a little bit, first of all, about the police role, really from my experience as being an expert witness. But also, I sit as a magistrate in East Sussex, and that gives me some insight as well into how the world is changing and how the abuse of vulnerable adults is being taken more seriously. I think from the point of view of being a JP, we are seeing lots and lots of cases now. It's quite routine to see cases and deal with cases which are in respect of domestic violence. However, I think that the numbers of cases that are coming before us as magistrates that are to do with prosecution of someone because they've been a vulnerable adult in terms of abuse or harm still remain few and far between. I think that we need to be very much trying to change the mindset that the way that the police approach domestic violence should be considered for those when they're looking at how care workers, professional and health and social care professionals have supported people that may be at risk because they're in a relationship, although it may not be an intimate relationship, which of course it wouldn't be, but they are in a relationship of trust, and it's how that trust is breached, which is a crucial part. So for me, there's still a lot of work to be done for things to reach, get through the criminal justice system. But on the other hand, as my work as an expert witness, I have started seeing more and more cases that are coming to me as a nurse expert to give an opinion on cases. And they're very mixed as to what's coming forward. Some of them, obviously, I only see the tip of the iceberg, and there's good and bad that's coming through from the CPS and the police, as there is with every professional that's working in with adults at risk. So my view is that things are changing, things are improving, and certainly from when I was involved in the Orchid View investigation in 2011, things have improved enormously. We had 6 nurses arrested at Orchid View, but none of them were charged. We could not get, working very closely with the police, we could not get the CPS to actually understand what they were looking at all. So I think it's always very important to remember that it may not be that the police are the ones that are, that it's the difficulty with the police in their understanding of what's going on. It's actually getting CPS to actually understand what's going on as well, and getting them to understand how they might take this forward and what criminal charges that need to be brought. A case that I was involved with only last year in another part of the UK was where 7 care workers were charged. The trial had been set, and they were from a domiciliary care agency, and they were all charged with willful neglect of one gentleman who had an acquired brain injury and lived in sort of a sheltered housing type scheme, and he constantly refused, deafing and blinding at them every time they knocked on the door, refusing to let them in. Now those and in the end, when he got so ill that the doctor got in, his leg was found to be gangrenous and he lost his leg. And the 7 care workers were charged with willful neglect. And it was going to court, but a new police officer took over and decided to get the case reviewed and asked if I would have a look at the information. What became very clear is that this gentleman had been assessed by the local authority, his social worker, that he had capacity to understand the implications. He had capacity to understand the implications of refusing to have routine treatment that he needed on his leg, whatever, I can't remember the detail. That the care workers had knocked every day, that they had gone back 3 times a day, every day. They'd been abused through the letterbox, he wouldn't let them in. And every day those care workers had gone back and reported it to their manager, and their manager had then reported it to the local authority, and the local authority social worker had reported it to the senior managers to say, we actually know that this gentleman gets on better with male staff than he does with female staff, perhaps we should try some male staff. And the senior manager said, no, we can't afford them. And it was the care workers that were actually facing trial. The trial date was set. And I looked at this alongside a social work colleague. He looked at what the social workers had done, and I looked at what the care workers had done. And we wrote back and said, my report said, these care workers had done what they could within their sphere of influence. They had done everything that they could, and the trial was abandoned. But how much, and it was 3 years that these care workers had gone through that trauma of believing that they were being prosecuted for willful neglect. But I've also experienced a very good case where a new care worker in a care home witnessed another care worker who'd been there for 4 years, manhandling this lady, putting her arms behind her back, forcing her arms up, forcing her onto a commode. Now, there was no CCTV footage of this. This was one care worker, a new care worker's word against the other. When she went to her manager was very dismissive of her because she'd only been there 3 weeks, and the care worker, the perpetrator, had been there 4 years. However, she did take the bold step of contacting Safeguarding herself. And it was one word against another, effectively. And you had a manager of a care home saying, well, he's been here for 4 years and no one else has ever complained. However, the police did listen to that care worker, and they listened very carefully, and I got involved and did a report based on the statements that the perpetrator had also made and how he described the best way of looking after this lady. It was clearly not the best way at all. And it did go to trial, and he was found guilty and was given a 1-year suspended prison sentence. I understand that the new care worker that had reported him actually had a really hard time from her manager and left the care industry. But the police believed her, and that was what made the difference. I also know of a lady where there has been a case recently reported to me, actually only last week, where an older person appeared very, very frightened of care worker that went in the room, and when other care workers went in, they found that this lady had a lot of significant bruising in her groin area. They took photographs, they took all the evidence and called the police straight away. The police said that they wouldn't investigate as the victim was unreliable because she had dementia. My thoughts on that, as I said once to a CPS prosecutor, is how do you ever investigate murder? Because I'm pretty sure the victim in murder cases is an unreliable witness. If you can investigate murder when they can't tell you what happened, why can't you investigate when someone who's lost the ability to recall accurately and tell you what's happened? I can't work that one out, but I'm only a simple nurse. I'm not a barrister. So when we did the Old Deanery programme in 2014, the Panorama programme that some of you may remember, the police weren't interested before it went out. And the programme was aired, and then the police became very interested, and actually 3 people went to prison. What was interesting about that was that I got a phone call from the police after the programme went out and said, will you make a statement? Because you were the expert witness on the programme. And I said, well, you can ask 4 other million people to make a statement. 4 million people watched it and were horrified. You don't need me to make a statement. Do you need me to do an expert witness report? Oh, yes, perhaps that's what we mean. So they were even unsure about what they wanted. So for me, I find it's improving enormously. When we did Orchid, when I was the lead nurse, as I say, in Orchid View in 2011, we didn't even get the police. We all worked very hard together. We didn't even get the CPS to take any of it seriously. We are making baby steps. We are taking forward, and that doesn't mean that everyone needs to be prosecuted. I don't believe that at all. But we do need to be taking it seriously, just like domestic violence is being taken seriously, just like other crimes are being taken seriously. But it's a long, slow road, and I think the police suffer in exactly the same way as most of the professionals involved, is that the teams are small. People who get passionate and dedicated and become very expert then suddenly find themselves moved on to other jobs, and someone else comes in who may be very enthusiastic, has never come across it before, and struggles to get their head around it. The days we need to try to get people to actually accept that safeguarding adults at risk is just as specialist as safeguarding children, and requires a very high level of skills and expertise and understanding of all the issues involved. So in terms of what I was asked also to talk about, which is about how victims' relatives should be supported in this session. Could I just have that picture up, please? And I thought, well, how can victims' relatives be supported when there is a safeguarding? So I asked, there's two stories of, I'll come up with just a list of what I feel are the recommendations that I've worked out from these 2 very small stories. The first story is Leslie Lincoln, who spoke here 2 years ago. I think it was 2 years ago. She's a daughter of one of the victims at Orchid View. And I contacted Leslie and said, how did you feel you should have been supported? And she sent me a long email. And bearing in mind, I was the lead nurse working with the police and social services, and we worked our socks off to try and get that right. And then you hear how you got it so wrong is actually very hard. But Leslie, whose mother, Enid Trodden, died at Orchid View, and the coroner, there was an inquest into the death of 19 people, and her mum was one of the ones that died of natural causes attributable to neglect. And she said that a number of things about how she felt that relatives should have been supported. She said that she felt no one believed what she was saying. No one took any action to rectify the situation that she was describing for a long time. either from the provider or the staff or the GPs or social services or CQC. She felt that nobody was listening to her. This was even before the balloon went up. She said her mum ended up in hospital again, and again she raised a safeguarding alert, and again she complained. But her mum wasn't allowed to go back to Orchid View because by this time a large safeguarding investigation was going on. So her mum wasn't allowed to go home because we were protecting everybody in that care home. But her mum wasn't allowed to go home, effectively to die, because a safeguarding wisdom was that she needed to stay safe. So she died in a place that she didn't feel was home because we felt we were protecting. So she felt devastated that she couldn't even get her mum home to die, to the nursing home that actually had abused her. She said that it felt that no one had any rights. Her mum was asking to go back to her suite, which is what she called it, to go back to be going where she felt was home. But it appeared that the victim had no rights either. So she found herself trying to run work. She was a nurse herself, run a home, be part of the family, be a carer and advocate for her mum and fight the battle for everyone, not having the whole information, everyone keeping stum about what was going on, because, of course, with data protection and confidentiality, we couldn't tell anybody what was going on. There were rumours floating about the deaths due to the overdoses, etc., leaving everybody bewildered and angry. They were seeing the police coming in. They were seeing the place crawling with social workers and nurses. But we couldn't tell them because we weren't allowed to. You develop a mistrust in all the professionals. Professionals you believe are the same mind as yourself, seeking what is in the best interest of your loved one. But the reality is that everyone is protecting their own interests and defending their own actions, and no one is actually advocating for the individual or the family member. She said it was horrific to be involved in a police investigation and having no one to guide you through the process, to learn via an inquest what others had also gone through, and that everyone felt the same, alone, afraid, mistrustful of professionals and having to navigate an alien system with no one acting as a true advocate for you and for your loved one. I actually can recall specifically asking if we could involve the Relatives and Residents Association to come and form support groups for the family members, but we were not allowed to do that because of it being a police investigation. The police did not want the family members knowing each other and talking to each other too much because it might prejudice a future criminal case. She goes on to say, we were victims, but there is no victim to support in these. There is no victim support in these situations. Victims of crime get support, but victim support does not follow through or help family members or even the vulnerable people themselves. So she felt right in saying that no one was really on my side, on my mother's side, when I read the witness statements of the social workers saying that I was overzealous, that I'd overstepped the boundaries. They didn't believe me, nor did they consider taking any action, leaving me floundering alone and unheard, whilst my mother and others suffered. The coroner's summing up suffered that I was right and my mother and others' death was attributed to by neglect, and then suddenly all went to make amends and change their statements or read their statements, not even giving us the chance to question them about during the inquest. So once again the family members felt as if on trial, having to be cross-examined but not the professionals. Again, it feels like different rules for different people. Now that results have left and confirmation that what I was saying was right all the time, my thoughts were vindicated. But you're left devastated, relieved but angry, and guilt sets in as there's no one to guide you through the process at all. She sent me this picture. She said she found it online and she feels it sums her up exactly. As you can see, a lady with her head bowed in front of a panel of people, and at the bottom it says, "It's not that we don't believe you. It's not that we don't believe your story. It's just that we don't care." That was how she was left feeling by the process. But then I thought about closer to home, and I thought, well, how have I been feeling recently? I'd had a lot of dealings with safeguarding when my dad was in care. He lived with dementia for 12 years. But very recently, my mum died 2 months ago, and we cared for her at home, and it was what she wanted. She died of COPD. And we had the hospice and the home care agency. And at one time they gave us a living carer because we felt it was it was what suited Mum and her need to smoke 40 cigarettes a day. And we had this living carer, and I was exhausted because I was also there, and I was, for the last 2 weeks, with her all the time and was getting about 2 or 3 hours sleep. And the living carer was lovely to start with, very helpful. All the time Mum didn't need a lot of personal care, and she was chatty, and she really got to know Mum and understood about her fags and that she wouldn't eat and she wouldn't wash. And Mum was, single-minded to the end. And she made a friend of us all. And it's only when you start looking back afterwards, here am I doing what I do, but I was there as a daughter, very exhausted, looking after my mum as she died. And one evening, I was sitting in the garden, and this carer was chatting to me and started asking me about how much my mum's house was worth and who was going to be inheriting it. And then she started telling me about how she was not being paid until the middle of August, and she wasn't sure how she was going to pay the bills. And then she started telling me about her daughter and how her daughter wanted to set up a new business, but they didn't quite have enough money to do it. Now, and then she started looking around. She was looking around and we were chatting, and she actually asked me which member of the family would be buying the house. And then she started chatting about Mum's ornaments, and she actually suggested one of them that she'd quite like to have as a souvenir. Now, I didn't bite, I didn't respond, but I thought, where is all this going? And I am pretty vulnerable, but I am not half as vulnerable as my mum is laying there in that bed. And only 4 days earlier, my mum was still able to talk and was still able to be directing what she wanted, but was still as hell as vulnerable and had money that she was giving to people saying, can you go and get me cigarettes? Can you go and get me cigarettes? So then my mum really needed proper care, good care. Syringe driver went up. She couldn't move about anymore. And the care practice that this woman gave was appalling. She did drag lifts. She didn't wash her. We were there. We were watching. And I said, this isn't acceptable. She actually even refused to do care. So I phoned her boss and said, I don't like her. I don't like what she's doing. But my mum was near to death, and I said, we'll put up with her, because I didn't want to cause disruption, because I've got the CCG on my back saying she could always go in a care home, she can always go in a care home. The care package is now getting too expensive, she could always go in a care home. And my mum wanted to die at home, so I wasn't going to rock any boats, and I decided I'll keep her here. So on the Sunday morning, she went shopping with my son. I let her go off shopping with my son. The way that the food for her food was arranged had all been sorted out. But my son didn't know how the food was arranged and how the food was sorting out. And in the shopping basket, she put in £20 worth of very expensive prawns and sauces and bits and pieces that she decided she wanted, even though her food had already been purchased. And just said to my son, no, that goes in the basket. And he didn't know anything, so my mum paid for that. And he came home. And he didn't say anything because he didn't know he had to. And I saw these prawns in the fridge. So I waited. And a bit later on I went out and she was getting her lunch and she had these prawns. And I said, oh, they look very tasty. Are you treating yourself to some prawns? Yes, she said. Another opportunity I gave her to tell me, oh, actually, by the way, I owe you for those prawns. So I phoned the care agency that afternoon and said, she's got to go. I can't trust her anymore. She's been grooming us. She's now actually, okay, it was only £20 worth of shopping, but she actually deceived my family. She deceived all of us. I suggested to the care agency on the Monday morning, you come and pick her up. I'll phone CHC. We'll try and get something else organised. I suggest care agency, live at home care agency, you phone CQC, you report this, and you report it's a safeguarding. Because if you don't, I will. They turned up at the home, at my mum's house, and they listened to her story, and then the senior manager came in and said, well, we don't think it's a safeguarding. I said, I'm telling you this is safeguarding. I'm telling you that we are very vulnerable, and actually she could have had all sorts of things. We don't know. She's been in that house. My mum had money in a purse. I don't know what my mum had. Anyway, we raised it as a safeguarding, and she was removed from the house. They never raised it as a safeguarding. Local authority have confirmed that. After she'd gone, we found a carrier bag full of recycling things that she'd been saving apparently for her grandson. She was going to carry a bag from the south coast, Sussex, East Sussex, from Heathfield to Tooting Bec. She was going to take a carrier bag of toilet rolls and plastic containers, and you think, really? At the bottom of it was a load of stuff that she'd actually been taking out of some of the drawers. Bits, odd things, but things that were my mum's property. So we also kept that. And when I phoned social services, local authority raised a safeguarding, I said, we've been deceived. She works as a living carer. She's been plotting to steal. She's been hiding these things. Gave her the whole story. I kept the receipt, took the photographs, did everything that I did, that I thought was right. It took a long history from the social worker, took a long history and did all the U's and R's and, oh, isn't that sad, and how's your mum, and all that sort of stuff. That was on the Monday morning. My mum died on the Friday. 3 weeks later, I had a letter from social services to say, well, you said this and you said that, but unfortunately, the carer didn't really want to engage with us, and it was your word against hers. So the police said they're not interested, and it was your word against hers. There's no evidence to support any of it. So I wrote a letter back and I said, you haven't spoken to the other 3 family members. You haven't been and collected the photographs that I took of everything. You haven't been and collected the receipt. You haven't done any of those things. There's all that evidence. I don't understand why. Okay, if you still come back and say it's not happened or it's not safeguarding, but please look at all the evidence. So I wrote that letter, gave him the phone numbers of all the family members, said what I got. I got a letter only last week, just 2 lines to say, just to let you know, Mrs. Phair, the case is now closed. That home care worker, that living carer is out there somewhere. And as sure as eggs are eggs, she's going to be finding a family that's a little bit more vulnerable than me. So how did that leave me feeling? Because that's what we're talking about. Well, linking that with how Leslie felt. I felt that the person at risk mustn't be discriminated against, whether that's the family member speaking for them or them themselves, that their allegations should be treated and taken seriously. I don't feel I was believed. I don't agree with this. This might be how Leslie felt. I don't feel I was believed. I don't feel that the authorities actually cared. I don't feel, and neither did Leslie, feel that they actually are understanding that it wasn't about the 20 quid's worth of food and this funny collection of things that she'd taken from my mum's drawer in our house. But who is she living with now? Who was she living with before? She knew what she was doing, and when I looked back, I could see what she was actually doing. And if my mum had stayed well enough for any longer, she'd give you the top brick off a chimney, my mum, if she thought someone was in trouble. She would have had money from my mum. I know it. I felt I needed to be kept informed as Leslie did. And I felt I needed to be taken seriously, and that they needed to collect all the information and speak to everybody that we'd said that needed to be spoken to before saying, there's nothing in it, case closed. A crime is a crime and should be seen that way. And I do feel that crimes against vulnerable older people are often, and vulnerable people are not seen as the same way as crimes against other people. As a magistrate, we have people coming in, they've stolen £2.50's worth of bacon from the co-op. This woman she deceived, she knowingly knew my son didn't know the arrangements. She knowingly took £20 from my mum by getting her to pay the food. That was deception. By any other name, that was deception. So what is it? Value not enough? I don't know. The inability of the victim to give an account shouldn't stop the police investigating or CPS prosecuting. As I've already said, they have amazing ways of doing amazing things with crimes when the victim can't speak. Why can't those same processes be applied? So relatives need to be supported in all sorts of different ways. Sometimes I know from experience of having my nursing hat on, it's not possible, but you want to do it. But we have to find ways so that people do understand why things are being done. And as far as my own recent experience with my mum, I think it left me thinking, why did I bother to spend all that time reporting it, because no one listened anyway. People must be listened to. Victims and their families must be listened to, and they must feel that they have been believed. Thank you.